This is the parable of the Good Samaritan. Luke chapter 10, verses 25 to 37. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he asked, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" "What is written in the law?" he replied. "How do you read it?" He answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbour as yourself." "You have answered correctly," Jesus replied. "Do this and you will live." But he wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbour?" In reply, Jesus said, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he fell into the hands of robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he travelled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring an oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, took him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 silver coins and gave them to the innkeeper. "Look after him," he said, "and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have." Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbour to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? The expert in the law replied, "The one who had mercy on him." Jesus told him, "Go and do likewise."
Well, we've just heard the story of the Good Samaritan being read for us from Luke chapter 10. It's a very well-known parable of Jesus. It's only in Luke's Gospel, but it's one which I think many people know. And it's a story which is in response to 2 questions which Jesus was challenged with by a teacher of the law, an expert in the Torah. And we really begin to ask what motivates the teacher of the law to ask Jesus these 2 questions. It says in verse 25, on one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. The King James Version actually says stood up to tempt Jesus. So the word tempting is perhaps a negative interpretation of what is going on here, but maybe the test is a more positive way of looking at this interaction between Jesus and the teacher of the law. And he asks a couple of questions in verse 25 and then again in verse 29. And I think the context of this parable is that Jesus is now a well-known teacher. He's been travelling around Galilee, he's been ministering in Jerusalem, and people are beginning to ask questions. Is this Jesus worth following? Is this Jesus someone I should oppose? Is this Jesus someone I should trust? So the teacher of the law is asking Jesus a question, and I think it's a bit like a job interview question. And how Jesus responds to this is going to shape how this teacher of the law will respond to Jesus. So Jesus responds to the question, who is my neighbour, and what must I do to inherit eternal life? Jesus responds to those questions by telling a story. It's a story set along the desert road from Jerusalem all the way down to the lowest point on earth, to Jericho. So the story is that the man is going down from Jerusalem, and we know that was a very dangerous route, full of outlaws, and on that journey you were kind of taking a little bit of a risk going on that journey. Now the man who is beaten up and is robbed is not identified at the beginning of the story, and because he's stripped naked, the people passing by wouldn't know what tribe or what group he belonged to. Just as today, people are identified to some extent by the clothing we wear. So if you saw a woman wearing a burqa, you would assume that she was a Muslim. If you see someone wearing a dog collar, you think they might be representing the church. But this man is naked, so when people pass by, they don't know, is he Jewish? Is he a Roman soldier? Is he a Samaritan? We're not told when we walk past what this man is. But we are told in the story that a priest and a Levi, two leaders from the Jewish traditions, pass by on the other side. I suppose the question is, why did they pass by? What was motivating them not to stop? I suppose in one sense, there was a fear of entrapment. If this is a fake situation, if this man isn't genuinely hurt, but he's simply trapping them, so when they stop, when they get off their horse or their donkey and they go over to him, his companions will suddenly jump out. It could be a setup. So there may be a genuine fear of being trapped and being vulnerable. So they may pass by because, they're fearful. There's also a sense, if you do stop, imagine the cost and time in caring for this man. It's going to set you back a lot of your time, and your journey will be hindered if you choose to stop. The third reason is the priest and the Levite were both serving in the temple, and they would have needed to be ritually clean for the services they were going to do. And the law made it clear that if you touched a dead body, and this man may well be dead, they would then be disqualified for a period of time of serving in the temple. So they might argue, I didn't stop, not because I didn't care, but because my priority is to serve as a Levite, as a priest, and therefore I couldn't risk stopping because my first priority is to serve in the temple. So we're not sure why people didn't stop, but there's probably a mixture of reasons. But the Samaritan who goes past does stop. He stops, he takes pity on the man, and he made a long-term plans to care for him. And Jesus then returns the question back to the questioner, to the teacher of the law, and he says, Jesus then says, who is the neighbor? Who is doing the right thing here? This is in verse 36. Now, the expert of the law in verse 37, it's very interesting in the text, declines to answer. Now, obviously, the answer is, it's the Samaritan. He did the right thing. He was the neighbor. He was kind and just. But he doesn't say that. He simply says, the one who was kind to him. He can't utter the name Samaritan because there was so much enmity between Samaritans and Jews at this time. The fact he can't speak the name reflects the loathing he had towards the Samaritans. Now, we know from the Gospels and from the history of the time that there was real conflict between Jews and Samaritans. In John 4, for example, the disciples are shocked because Jesus is speaking to a Samaritan woman at the well. So it's both the fact that she's a woman and she's a Samaritan, which brings concerns to them. In Luke chapter 9, just the previous chapter to this, we have this moment where the disciples are going through a Samaritan village. They are not welcomed by the local inhabitants, and the disciples say to Jesus, let's call down fire from heaven and punish these people. Let's zap them. God must be angry with them. So there's this embedded distrust or hatred for the Samaritans. Yet in the Gospel, in Acts chapter 8, when the church is spreading the good news of Jesus, in Acts chapter 8, we hear that the gospel took root in the Samaritan community. And in many ways, the Samaritan yes to the gospel, recorded in Acts 8, opens up the gospel to the wider Jewish world and the wider Gentile world as well. So this is a very well-known story It's about how we care for people in need. And I suppose the question is, which we may want to reflect on as we look at this in more detail, is who is my neighbour? I guess all of us as followers of Jesus, we want to honour our faith through our relationships. But there may be certain people who we feel are beyond our concern. There may be a hierarchy of people we would help, and there may be certain people we would choose not to help. And we may ask the question, is anyone beyond God's redemptive love and care? And this story is challenging all of us that no one is beyond God's love and care. As we hear in John's Gospel, John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son. So the love of God is not just for one particular group, the Samaritans or the Jewish people, or for us today. God's love is for the whole world. And I suppose the challenge to us is to realize that no one is beyond God's redemptive, caring love. Not the Samaritan, not the priests, not the Levi, not the Roman soldiers, and not us. We're all part of God's big story. So there's a lot in this well-known story. I hope some of those points I've made will be helpful to you, and I encourage you to read this again and to reflect on what the Lord is saying to you. Thank you.